Prince Alexander had always been different from other royal children. While most princes spent their days in fancy clothes attending boring ceremonies, Alexander preferred walking around the palace grounds in simple clothes, talking to servants and guards. At just 16 years old, he had already earned a reputation for being kind and curious about how ordinary people lived. The kingdom of Valdoria was known for its beautiful mountains and peaceful valleys. King Marcus, Alexander's father, ruled with fairness and wisdom. Queen Isabella, his mother, was loved by the people for her charity work. But Alexander wanted to do more than just wave from balconies. He wanted to understand the real problems his future subjects faced every day. On this particular autumn morning, the leaves were turning golden and the air was crisp. Alexander had finished his morning lessons with his tutors and decided to take a walk through the palace gardens. He often did this to clear his mind and think about what he had learned. The palace was huge, with many corridors, towers, and hidden passages that even he hadn't explored completely. As he walked past the rose garden, Alexander heard voices coming from behind the old stone wall that separated the main palace from the guard quarters. The voices sounded upset, and one of them was crying. Alexander's curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly moved closer to listen. Through a small gap in the wall, he could see 3 palace guards sitting on wooden benches. One of them, a young man about 25 years old, was holding his head in his hands and sobbing. The other 2 guards looked worried and kept looking around to make sure nobody was watching them. "Thomas, you have to tell someone about this," said the first guard, whose name was Marcus. "You can't keep carrying this burden alone." "Tell who?" Thomas replied, his voice shaking. "Who would believe me? And, even if they did, what could they do? My family will starve if I lose this job, and my little sister needs medicine that costs more money than I make in 3 months. The third guard, an older man named Robert, put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "We know you're a good man, Thomas. What happened to you wasn't fair, but keeping quiet about it won't make it go away." Alexander pressed closer to the wall, trying to understand what they were talking about. He had known these guards for years. They had always been respectful and hard-working. Thomas, in particular, had been one of his favorites because he always smiled and asked about Alexander's studies whenever they passed each other in the hallways. "Captain Roderick said if I ever speak about what I saw, he'll make sure I'm thrown out of the royal guard and blacklisted from every job in the kingdom," Thomas continued. "He said he has friends in high places who can make my life very difficult. But I can't sleep at night knowing what I know." Captain Roderick was the head of palace security, a position he had held for over 10 years. He was a tall, stern man with a thick black mustache who always wore his uniform perfectly pressed. Alexander had never particularly liked him because he seemed cold and unfriendly, but his father trusted him completely. "What exactly did you see, Thomas?" Robert asked gently. "Maybe if you tell us the whole story, we can figure out what to do." Thomas looked around nervously before speaking in a whisper. "Last month, when I was doing the late-night patrol of the Treasury Wing, I saw Captain Roderick coming out of the royal vault with a large bag. He wasn't supposed to be there at that time, and he definitely wasn't supposed to have anything with him when he left." Alexander's heart started beating faster. The royal vault contained not just money, but precious jewels, important documents, and family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations. Only a few people had access to it, and there were strict rules about when and why anyone could enter. "I thought maybe the king had given him a special mission," Thomas continued, "so I didn't say anything at first. But then, I noticed that some of the golden plates from the state dinner collection were missing from the display case in the Great Hall. When I mentioned it to the head butler, he said that Captain Roderick had told him they were being cleaned and repaired." Marcus and Robert exchanged worried looks. "That doesn't necessarily mean anything," Marcus said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe they really were being repaired." "That's what I thought too," Thomas replied. "But then, a week later, I was in town buying medicine for my sister, and I saw those exact same golden plates being sold in Henrik's antique shop. When I asked Henrik where he got them, he said a man matching Captain Roderick's description had sold them to him, claiming they were family heirlooms he needed to sell quickly." Alexander felt his stomach drop. Hendrik's antique shop was known throughout the kingdom for buying and selling valuable items, but he was also known for not asking too many questions about where things came from. If Captain Roderick was really stealing from the palace and selling royal treasures, it was not just theft, it was treason. "Did you tell Henrik who you were?" Robert asked. "No, I was in regular clothes, and Henrik doesn't know I work at the palace," Thomas replied. "But I pretended to be interested in buying the plates, and Henrik showed me papers that proved their authenticity. They had the royal seal and everything. There's no doubt they came from our collection." The three guards sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Alexander could see the fear and confusion on their faces. They were simple, honest men who had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, and now they had discovered that their own captain was betraying that trust. "There's more," Thomas said finally, his voice barely audible. "Yesterday, I was cleaning the armory when I overheard Captain Roderick talking to someone outside the window. I couldn't see who it was, but I heard them discussing plans to take the big prize from the vault next week. They mentioned something about the Queen's diamond necklace, the one that belonged to her grandmother." Alexander knew exactly which necklace Thomas was talking about. It was his mother's most precious possession, worth more than most people would earn in their entire lives. But, more than its monetary value, it had deep sentimental meaning for his family. His great-grandmother had worn it on her wedding day, and it had been passed down through generations of queens. "Thomas, you have to report this to the king," Robert said firmly. "This isn't just about stealing money anymore. If they're planning to take the Queen's necklace, they're planning something much bigger." "But what if Captain Roderick finds out I reported him?" Thomas asked, panic clear in his voice. "What if he really does have powerful friends who can hurt my family? My sister is only 8 years old, and my mother is too sick to work. If something happens to me, they'll have nobody to take care of them." Alexander understood Thomas's fear, but he also knew that something had to be done. As he listened to the guard's conversation, he began to form a plan in his mind. He couldn't let Captain Roderick continue stealing from his family and threatening innocent people like Thomas. But he also couldn't let Thomas suffer for doing the right thing. The guards continued talking for several more minutes, but they couldn't come up with a solution that would protect Thomas while also stopping Captain Roderick. Finally, they agreed to meet again the next day to discuss their options further, and they went back to their duties. Alexander waited until they were gone before stepping out from behind the wall. His mind was racing with everything he had learned. He trusted Thomas completely. The young guard had always been honest and hard-working, and he had no reason to lie about something so serious. But Captain Roderick was his father's trusted advisor, and accusing him of treason was not something that could be done lightly. As Alexander walked back toward the palace, he thought about all the times he had seen Captain Roderick in meetings with his father. The man had always seemed confident and in control, offering advice about palace security and kingdom defense. But now Alexander wondered if there had been signs of his dishonesty that everyone had missed. He also thought about Thomas and his family. Alexander had met Thomas's little sister once when she had come to the palace with their mother to deliver some sewing work for the royal seamstresses. She was a sweet, shy girl who had been amazed by the palace's beautiful decorations. Thomas had been so proud to show her around, explaining the history of different paintings and sculptures. The idea that this honest, caring man was being threatened and intimidated made Alexander angry. That evening at dinner, Alexander watched Captain Roderick more carefully than usual. The man sat at the head table with other high-ranking officials, discussing security arrangements for an upcoming diplomatic visit. He seemed calm and professional, just as he always did. But Alexander noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Captain Roderick's clothes and accessories were quite expensive for someone who earned a guard's salary. His boots were made of the finest leather, his sword had an ornate silver handle, and he wore a gold ring that looked quite valuable. Of course, it was possible that these things were gifts or family heirlooms, but given what Thomas had overheard, they suddenly seemed suspicious. After dinner, Alexander excused himself and went to his room to think. He needed to figure out how to help Thomas without putting him in danger, and he needed to find a way to prove Captain Roderick's guilt before the man could steal the Queen's necklace. But, most importantly, he needed to do all of this without alerting Captain Roderick to the fact that his crimes had been discovered. As Alexander lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the palace settling into quiet, he made a decision that would change everything. He would not simply report what he had learned to his father. Instead, he would take matters into his own hands and find a way to catch Captain Roderick in the act. It was risky, and it would require careful planning, but it was the only way to protect Thomas while ensuring that justice was done. The next morning, Alexander woke up early and began to put his plan into action. He had always been clever and resourceful, but now he would need to be more careful and strategic than ever before. The safety of his family's treasures, Thomas's livelihood, and the integrity of the royal guard all depended on his ability to outsmart a man who had been fooling everyone for months. Alexander spent the morning observing the daily routines of the palace staff, paying special attention to when and where Captain Roderick could be found at different times of the day. He also began to think about who else he could trust to help him. He would need allies, but he would have to choose them very carefully to avoid tipping off Captain Roderick. Alexander spent the next 3 days carefully watching Captain Roderick's movements around the palace. He pretended to be interested in learning more about palace security, which gave him an excuse to ask questions and follow the captain around. Roderick seemed pleased that the young prince was showing interest in such matters, never suspecting that Alexander was actually investigating him. During his observations, Alexander noticed several suspicious patterns. Captain Roderick often disappeared for long periods during the afternoon, claiming he was inspecting the outer walls or meeting with village security officials. But Alexander discovered that he wasn't actually doing these things. When Alexander casually asked the outer wall guards if they had seen their captain recently, they said he hadn't been there in weeks. Alexander also noticed that Captain Roderick frequently visited Henrik's antique shop in town. This wouldn't have been unusual for anyone else, but for the head of palace security to regularly visit a shop known for questionable dealings seemed very suspicious. Alexander decided he needed to investigate this connection more closely. On Thursday afternoon, Alexander disguised himself as a common village boy by wearing simple brown clothes and a worn cloak that belonged to one of the stable hands. He had often done this before when he wanted to walk through town without being recognized, but never for such a serious purpose. This time, he was gathering evidence that could change everything. Alexander positioned himself across the street from Henrik's antique shop and waited. After about an hour, he saw Captain Roderick approaching the shop carrying a small bag. The captain looked around nervously before entering the shop, which confirmed Alexander's suspicions that he was trying to hide something. Alexander waited another few minutes before following Captain Roderick into the shop. Henrik was a short, round man with a gray beard and small, calculating eyes. He was known for being friendly to customers but ruthless in his business dealings. When Alexander entered, Henrik was examining something that Captain Roderick had taken out of his bag. "Ah, another beautiful piece," Henrik was saying. "The craftsmanship is exquisite. This will fetch a very good price from my contacts in the neighboring kingdoms." Alexander pretended to be browsing the shop's collection of old books and jewelry while straining to hear their conversation. He moved closer to a display case that was near the counter where they were talking. "Just remember our agreement," Captain Roderick said in a low voice. "No questions about where these items come from, and no records that could be traced back to me. And if anyone ever asks you about our business relationship, you've never seen me before in your life." Of course," Henrik replied with a sly smile. "My memory is very poor when it comes to such things. But, I must say, your family must have owned some truly remarkable heirlooms to possess such quality pieces." Alexander could see now that Captain Roderick had given Henrik a small silver goblet that Alexander recognized from the palace's ceremonial collection. It was used during important religious ceremonies and had been blessed by the kingdom's high priest many years ago. Seeing it being sold like common merchandise made Alexander feel sick to his stomach. "My family has been fortunate," Captain Roderick lied smoothly. "But times are difficult, and sometimes one must part with treasures to pay for necessities." This was obviously false. Captain Roderick had a comfortable home and appeared to want for nothing. Alexander could see that this was simply greed, not necessity. The captain was stealing precious items from the royal collection for personal profit, showing complete disregard for their historical and cultural significance. Henrik counted out a stack of gold coins and handed them to Captain Roderick. "Same time next week?" he asked. "Yes, but next week I'll have something much more valuable," Captain Roderick replied. "Something that will set us both up very nicely." Alexander's heart pounded as he realized they were talking about the Queen's diamond necklace. He had to stop this plan before it could be carried out, but he needed more evidence first. He also needed to figure out how Captain Roderick was getting access to these items without being noticed by other palace staff. After Captain Roderick left the shop, Alexander approached Henrik's counter, pretending to be interested in buying something for his sweetheart. Henrik showed him various pieces of jewelry, and Alexander managed to steer the conversation toward the items that Captain Roderick had been selling. "That silver goblet looked very interesting," Alexander said casually. "Do you have anything else from that same collection?" Henrik's eyes lit up with greed. "Ah, you have good taste, young man. That gentleman has brought me several pieces from his family's collection over the past few months. Very high quality, very old. But I'm afraid they're all quite expensive. Could you show me what else you have?" Alexander asked. "I'm willing to pay well for the right piece." Henrik disappeared into the back room and returned with a wooden box. Inside were 3 more items that Alexander recognized from the palace: a golden candlestick from the royal chapel, an ornate letter opener from his father's study, and a small painting that usually hung in the Queen's private sitting room. Alexander had to control his anger as he saw these precious family possessions being treated as mere merchandise. Each of these items had special meaning and history. The candlestick had been lit during his parents' wedding ceremony. The letter opener had belonged to his grandfather, who had used it to read important documents from allied kingdoms. The painting showed his great-grandmother as a young woman and was one of his mother's favorite artworks. "These are beautiful pieces," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice steady. "How did you say the gentleman came to possess them?" "Family inheritance, he says," Henrik replied. "Though between you and me, some of these pieces look like they might have royal connections. See this marking on the candlestick? That's very similar to the royal seal. Of course, many wealthy families use similar designs, so it could be from any noble house." Alexander could see that Henrik suspected these items were stolen from the palace, but he was choosing to ignore his suspicions because the profit was too good to pass up. This made Henrik an accomplice to Captain Roderick's crimes, but it also meant that he might be willing to cooperate if the alternative was being arrested for receiving stolen goods. "I'll need to think about which piece I'd like to purchase," Alexander said. "May I return tomorrow?" "Of course," Henrik replied. "But don't wait too long. Items of this quality tend to sell quickly." Alexander left the shop with his mind spinning. He now had proof that Captain Roderick was stealing from the palace and selling the items to Henrik. But he still needed to figure out exactly how the captain was accessing these items and when he was planning to steal the Queen's necklace. That evening, Alexander decided it was time to approach Thomas directly. He couldn't solve this problem alone, and Thomas deserved to know that someone was taking his concerns seriously. Alexander also needed Thomas's help to understand the security procedures that Captain Roderick might be exploiting. Alexander found Thomas near the stables, where he was checking the security of the outer courtyard. Alexander approached him carefully, making sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Thomas, I need to speak with you privately about something very important," Alexander said. Thomas looked surprised and a little nervous. "Of course, Your Highness. How can I help you?" "I know about Captain Roderick," Alexander said simply. "I know about the golden plates, and I know about the threats he's made against you." Thomas's face went pale, and he looked around frantically to make sure nobody else was nearby. "Your Highness, I don't know what you mean," he said, but his voice was shaking. "Thomas, I overheard your conversation with Marcus and Robert 3 days ago," Alexander explained gently. "I know you're afraid, and I understand why. But I want to help you stop Captain Roderick before he can steal anything else." Thomas stared at Alexander for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether he could trust the young prince with such dangerous information. Finally, he seemed to make up his mind. "Your Highness, if Captain Roderick finds out that I've spoken to anyone about this, he'll destroy my family," Thomas said desperately. "He's already made it clear that he has powerful friends who can make problems for people who cross him." "That's exactly why we need to stop him," Alexander replied. "Thomas, I've been investigating Captain Roderick for the past few days, and I've found evidence that proves you're telling the truth. He's been selling stolen palace treasures to Henrik's antique shop, and he's planning to steal my mother's diamond necklace next week." Thomas's eyes widened in shock. "You've been investigating him yourself?" "Your Highness, that's incredibly dangerous. If he discovers what you're doing, then we'll have to make sure he doesn't discover it," Alexander interrupted. "But I can't do this alone, Thomas. I need your help to understand how he's gaining access to these items without being noticed." Thomas was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with his fear and his desire to do the right thing. Finally, he spoke in a whisper. "Captain Roderick has master keys to every room in the palace," Thomas explained. "He also has access to all the security schedules, so he knows exactly when different areas will be unguarded. And, because he's the head of security, nobody questions his presence anywhere in the palace, even in areas where he wouldn't normally have business." "How often does he work alone?" Alexander asked. "Usually during the afternoon shift change," Thomas replied. "There's a period of about 30 minutes when the morning guards are finishing their duties and the evening guards haven't started yet. Captain Roderick often volunteers to cover this time himself, claiming he wants to personally ensure that security isn't compromised during the transition." Alexander realized that this was the perfect opportunity for Captain Roderick to steal items without being observed. During those 30 minutes, he could access any room in the palace without having to explain his presence to other guards. "Thomas, I have an idea," Alexander said. "But it will require you to be very brave, and it will require you to trust that I can protect you and your family from Captain Roderick's threats." "What do you want me to do?" Thomas asked, though Alexander could see that he was still frightened. "I want you to continue your normal duties as if nothing has changed," Alexander explained. "But I also want you to carefully observe Captain Roderick's movements during those afternoon shift changes. I need to know exactly which rooms he visits and how long he spends in each one." "And then, what?" Thomas asked. "Then, we're going to catch him in the act," Alexander replied. "And, when we do, we'll have enough evidence to prove his guilt beyond any doubt. More importantly, we'll be able to protect you by showing that you were helping to uncover his crimes, not hiding them." Thomas still looked uncertain, but Alexander could see that he was beginning to hope that there might be a way out of his difficult situation. "Your Highness, even if we catch Captain Roderick stealing something, how do we know that people will believe us over him?" Thomas asked. "He's been the king's trusted advisor for 10 years. I'm just a regular guard." "That's exactly why our evidence has to be absolutely perfect," Alexander replied. "We can't just catch him taking something. We need to be able to prove that he's been doing this for months, and we need to have witnesses who can't be intimidated or bought off." Alexander spent the rest of their conversation explaining his plan in detail. It was risky and would require perfect timing, but if it worked, they would be able to stop Captain Roderick and protect Thomas's family at the same time. More importantly, they would be able to recover the stolen items and restore them to their rightful place in the royal collection. As they parted ways that evening, Alexander felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Tomorrow, he would begin the most dangerous part of his investigation. He would need to be smarter and more careful than ever before, because one mistake could ruin everything and put both him and Thomas in serious danger. Alexander spent Friday morning carefully preparing for the most critical part of his plan. He had decided that the best way to catch Captain Roderick was to set up a situation where the captain would be forced to reveal his criminal activities in front of reliable witnesses. But this required Alexander to think several steps ahead and anticipate how Captain Roderick might react when cornered. The first part of Alexander's plan involved recruiting additional allies who could serve as witnesses. He couldn't rely on Thomas alone, because Captain Roderick had already threatened him. Alexander needed people who were beyond the captain's reach and whose word would be trusted absolutely by his father and the royal court. Alexander decided to approach Sir Edmund, the kingdom's chief legal advisor, and Master William, the palace's head treasurer. Both men were known for their honesty and attention to detail, and both had worked for the royal family for over 20 years. More importantly, both had access to records that could help prove the extent of Captain Roderick's thefts. Alexander found Sir Edmund in the palace library, where he was reviewing legal documents related to upcoming trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms. Sir Edmund was a thin, scholarly man with grey hair and kind eyes. He had always been patient with Alexander's questions about law and governance, and Alexander trusted him completely. "Sir Edmund, I need your advice about a very serious legal matter," Alexander said, sitting down across from the older man. "Of course, Your Highness," Sir Edmund replied, setting aside his documents. "What can I help you with?" Alexander took a deep breath and began to explain everything he had learned about Captain Roderick's activities. He told Sir Edmund about Thomas's observations, his own investigation of Henrik's shop, and the evidence he had gathered about the stolen items. Sir Edmund listened carefully, occasionally asking questions for clarification, but never interrupting or expressing disbelief. When Alexander finished his explanation, Sir Edmund was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the seriousness of what he had been told. "These are very grave accusations, Your Highness," Sir Edmund said finally. "If what you've discovered is true, Captain Roderick has committed multiple acts of treason against the crown. But, as you've pointed out, we'll need absolutely solid evidence to proceed with such charges." "That's why I need your help," Alexander replied. "I have a plan to catch Captain Roderick in the act, but I need witnesses who can't be intimidated or discredited." Sir Edmund nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" Alexander explained his plan in detail. Sir Edmund would need to be positioned in a specific location at a specific time, ready to observe and document Captain Roderick's actions. Sir Edmund would also need to bring the official royal seal with him, so that any evidence they gathered could be properly authenticated according to kingdom law. "This plan is quite dangerous, Your Highness," Sir Edmund warned. "If Captain Roderick realizes what we're doing before we have sufficient evidence, he could destroy what we've already gathered and disappear before he can be arrested." "I know it's risky," Alexander acknowledged. "But if we don't act soon, he's going to steal my mother's diamond necklace, and who knows what else he might take after that." Sir Edmund agreed to help, and they arranged to meet the next day to coordinate their timing with the other participants in the plan. Next, Alexander approached Master William, whom he found in the Treasury office reviewing the monthly inventory reports. Master William was a meticulous man who kept detailed records of every valuable item in the palace. If anyone would notice discrepancies in the royal collection, it would be him. "Master William, I need to ask you about some items from the royal collection," Alexander said. "Have you noticed anything missing from the inventories recently?" Master William looked up from his ledgers with a concerned expression. "Actually, Your Highness, I have been noticing some irregularities over the past few months. Several small but valuable items seem to have been moved or are unaccounted for during our regular counts." "Which items?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Master William pulled out a separate ledger and showed Alexander a list of missing items. The list included all of the things that Alexander had seen in Henrik's shop, plus several additional pieces that he hadn't known were missing. "I brought these discrepancies to Captain Roderick's attention, since he's responsible for palace security," Master William continued. "But he assured me that these items were simply being cleaned or repaired, and that they would be returned to their proper places soon. He said he was personally overseeing their care to ensure their safety." Alexander felt his anger growing as he realized how thoroughly Captain Roderick had been deceiving everyone. The captain had used his position of trust to cover up his thefts, knowing that other palace staff would accept his explanations without question. "Master William, I have reason to believe that Captain Roderick has been lying to you," Alexander said carefully. "I think those items weren't being cleaned or repaired. I think they were being stolen." Master William's face went pale. "Your Highness, that's a very serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support such a claim?" Alexander explained what he had discovered, showing Master William the notes he had taken during his visits to Henrik's shop. Master William examined the descriptions carefully, comparing them to his own inventory records. "These descriptions match our missing items exactly," Master William said, his voice shaking with anger. "If Captain Roderick has really been selling royal treasures for personal profit, it's not just theft, it's a betrayal of everything we stand for as servants of the crown. Will you help me prove it?" Alexander asked. Master William agreed without hesitation. As the head treasurer, he had a responsibility to protect the royal collection, and he took that responsibility very seriously. He also had access to detailed records that would be crucial for documenting the full extent of Captain Roderick's crimes. With Sir Edmund and Master William now part of his team, Alexander felt more confident about his plan. But he still needed to coordinate the timing perfectly, and he needed to make sure that Thomas would be safe throughout the entire operation. That afternoon, Alexander met with Thomas again to go over the final details of their plan. Thomas had been observing Captain Roderick's movements as Alexander had requested, and he had discovered something very important. "Your Highness, I figured out when Captain Roderick is planning to steal the Queen's necklace," Thomas said excitedly. "Tomorrow is Saturday, and the royal family will be attending the harvest festival in the village. Captain Roderick knows that the palace will be mostly empty during that time, with only a skeleton crew of guards on duty." "How do you know this?" Alexander asked. "I overheard him talking to someone outside the palace walls last night," Thomas explained. "I couldn't see who it was, but they were discussing the timing. Captain Roderick said that tomorrow afternoon would be perfect because most of the palace staff would be either at the festival or given time off to enjoy the holiday." Alexander realized that this was both an opportunity and a challenge. The Harvest Festival was an important tradition where the royal family mingled with common people and celebrated the year's agricultural success. Alexander was expected to attend with his parents, but he would need to find a way to return to the palace without arousing suspicion. "Thomas, did you hear anything else about their plan?" Alexander asked. "They mentioned that Captain Roderick would enter the Queen's chambers at exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon," Thomas replied. "That's when the guard rotation leaves the royal wing completely unattended for about 20 minutes. This was perfect timing for Alexander's plan. He could attend the festival with his parents, then excuse himself early and return to the palace with Sir Edmund and Master William. They would be in position to catch Captain Roderick in the act of stealing the necklace." "Thomas, I need you to be very careful tomorrow," Alexander warned. "Captain Roderick can't suspect that we know about his plan. You need to act completely normal, even if you're nervous." "I understand, Your Highness," Thomas replied. "But what happens after we catch him? What if he tries to claim that he was just checking on the security of the Queen's chambers? That's why we need to catch him with the necklace actually in his possession," Alexander explained. "And that's why Master William will be with us. He can testify that the necklace was in its proper place before Captain Roderick entered the room, and that it was missing afterwards. Alexander spent the rest of Friday evening going over every detail of the plan with his allies. They would need to coordinate their movements precisely, communicate without making noise, and be prepared for Captain Roderick to react unpredictably when he realized he had been caught. Sir Edmund would be responsible for the legal aspects of the arrest, ensuring that proper procedures were followed so that Captain Roderick couldn't escape justice on a technicality. Master William would document the theft and provide expert testimony about the value and significance of the stolen items. Thomas would serve as a witness to Captain Roderick's suspicious activities over the past few months. Alexander would coordinate the operation and serve as the primary witness to the actual theft. As the prince, his testimony would carry significant weight in any legal proceedings. But, more importantly, his presence would ensure that Captain Roderick couldn't intimidate or threaten any of the other witnesses. That night, Alexander could barely sleep. He kept going over the plan in his mind, trying to anticipate everything that could go wrong. What if Captain Roderick changed his timing? What if he brought accomplices with him? What if he became violent when cornered? Alexander knew that tomorrow would test not just his intelligence and courage, but also his ability to protect the people who were helping him. As dawn broke on Saturday morning, Alexander felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that he had never experienced before. Today, he would either successfully expose a dangerous criminal and protect his family's treasures, or he would fail and possibly make the situation much worse for everyone involved. The harvest festival began in the late morning, and Alexander joined his parents in the royal carriage for the journey to the village square. The festival was always a joyful occasion, with music, dancing, food vendors, and games for children. Alexander usually loved these events because they gave him a chance to interact with ordinary people and learn about their lives. But, today, Alexander found it difficult to concentrate on the festivities. He kept checking the time and thinking about what was happening back at the palace. Captain Roderick was probably making his final preparations for the theft, never suspecting that his every move was being anticipated. At 2 o'clock, Alexander approached his parents and explained that he wasn't feeling well and would like to return to the palace to rest. King Marcus and Queen Isabella were concerned about their son's health, but they agreed to let him go back early with a small escort. Alexander's heart pounded as the carriage approached the palace. In exactly 1 hour, he would either succeed in catching Captain Roderick or fail spectacularly in his first real attempt to solve a serious problem on his own. Either way, he knew that after today, nothing would ever be the same. Alexander arrived at the palace at exactly 2:30, giving himself 30 minutes to coordinate with his team before Captain Roderick's planned theft. Sir Edmund and Master William were already waiting in the designated meeting spot, a small storage room near the royal wing that provided a clear view of the corridor leading to the Queen's chambers. "Everything is in position, Your Highness," Sir Edmund whispered. "I've brought the official seal and documentation materials as we discussed. Master William has verified that the Queen's necklace is currently in its proper place in her jewelry box. Thomas is stationed at the end of the corridor where he can observe anyone approaching," Master William added. "He'll signal us when Captain Roderick arrives." Alexander felt his heart racing as they reviewed their final preparations. Each person had a specific role to play, and the success of their plan depended on perfect coordination. They had only one chance to catch Captain Roderick in the act, and if they made any mistakes, he would likely cover up his crimes and disappear forever. At 5 minutes before 3 o'clock, Thomas appeared and gave them the signal they had been waiting for. Captain Roderick was approaching the royal wing, walking quickly and looking around nervously to make sure he wasn't being observed. Alexander and his team watched from their hiding place as Captain Roderick used his master key to unlock the door to the Queen's chambers. The captain looked confident and practiced, clearly indicating that this wasn't his first time stealing from the royal collection. "He's inside," Alexander whispered to his companions. "Master William, are you ready to verify what happens to the necklace?" "Ready, Your Highness," Master William replied, clutching his inventory ledger. They waited for what felt like hours but was actually only about 10 minutes. Finally, they saw Captain Roderick emerge from the Queen's chambers carrying a small velvet pouch that clearly contained something valuable. The captain locked the door behind him and began walking quickly toward the main palace exit. "Now," Alexander whispered, and the four of them stepped out of their hiding place. "Captain Roderick," Alexander called out in his most authoritative voice. "Please stop where you are." Captain Roderick spun around, and Alexander could see the shock and panic in his eyes. For a moment, the captain seemed frozen, clearly trying to figure out how much Alexander and his companions knew about his activities. "Your Highness," Captain Roderick said, attempting to sound normal despite his obvious nervousness. "What brings you back from the festival so early? I thought you would be enjoying the celebrations with your parents." "I came back because I needed to investigate reports of theft from the royal collection," Alexander replied calmly. "Sir Edmund, Master William, and Thomas have been helping me gather evidence about missing items from the palace." Captain Roderick's face went pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "I'm not sure what you mean, Your Highness. If there are items missing from the collection, I should be the first to know about it. Palace security is my responsibility." "That's exactly the problem," Alexander said. "Palace security is your responsibility, but you've been using your position to steal from the royal family for months." "That's a very serious accusation," Captain Roderick replied, his voice getting more aggressive. "Do you have any evidence to support such a claim?" Instead of answering directly, Alexander turned to Master William. Master William, would you please check the Queen's jewelry box and tell us whether the diamond necklace is in its proper place? Master William went into the Queen's chambers and returned a few moments later with a grim expression. The diamond necklace is missing from its usual location, he announced officially. According to my records, it was present and accounted for during this morning's inventory check. All eyes turned to Captain Roderick, who was still holding the velvet pouch. Alexander could see sweat forming on the captain's forehead as he realized how much trouble he was in. Captain Roderick, Sir Edmund said in his official legal voice, I must ask you to show us the contents of the pouch you're carrying. This pouch contains personal items that are none of your business, Captain Roderick replied defensively. I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Alexander said firmly. As the prince of this kingdom, I have the authority to inspect any items being carried within the palace grounds, especially when there's reason to suspect theft. Captain Roderick looked around desperately, clearly realizing that he was trapped. He could refuse to open the pouch, but that would only make him look more guilty. He could try to run, but he was surrounded and had nowhere to go. Finally, with shaking hands, he opened the velvet pouch and revealed the Queen's diamond necklace. The necklace sparkled brilliantly in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the corridor windows. It was even more beautiful than Alexander had remembered, with diamonds that seemed to capture and reflect every ray of light. But seeing it in Captain Roderick's possession, stolen from his mother's private chambers, made Alexander feel sick with anger. That necklace belongs to my mother, Alexander said, his voice trembling with emotion. It belonged to my great-grandmother, and my grandmother, and it should belong to my future wife someday. How dare you steal something so precious from our family? Captain Roderick finally seemed to realize that his situation was hopeless. His shoulders slumped in defeat, and, when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I never meant for it to go this far, he said. It started with just small things that I thought nobody would miss. I needed money for gambling debts, and I thought I could take a few items temporarily and return them later. But you didn't return them, Master William said accusingly. You sold them to Henrik's antique shop for personal profit. I have documentation showing that dozens of valuable items have disappeared from the royal collection over the past 6 months. And you threatened Thomas when he discovered your crimes, Alexander added. You used your position of authority to intimidate an honest guard who was just trying to do his job. Captain Roderick looked at Thomas with something that might have been shame. I'm sorry about that, he said quietly. I was desperate and scared. I knew that if the truth came out, I would lose everything. You were going to lose everything anyway, Sir Edmund pointed out. Theft is bad enough, but stealing from the royal family is treason. And threatening palace staff is abuse of power. You've committed multiple serious crimes that carry severe penalties. Alexander found himself feeling a mixture of anger and pity as he looked at Captain Roderick. The man had thrown away a distinguished career and betrayed the trust of everyone who had worked with him, all because of greed and poor judgment. But Alexander also realized that this situation presented an opportunity to demonstrate a different kind of leadership than his father might have shown. Captain Roderick, Alexander said slowly, what you've done is unforgivable, and you'll have to face the legal consequences of your actions. But I want to understand why this happened. Were you really just stealing because of gambling debts, or was there something else going on? Captain Roderick looked surprised by the question, clearly expecting only anger and condemnation from the prince. After a moment, he began to speak more honestly than he had since being caught. The gambling was part of it, he admitted. But I also felt like I deserved more than I was getting. I've been protecting this palace and this family for 10 years, risking my life every day, and I was still living in a small apartment and struggling to save money for the future. When I saw all these beautiful, valuable things just sitting in display cases, I convinced myself that taking a few of them wouldn't really hurt anyone. But it did hurt people, Alexander replied. It hurt Thomas, who was afraid for his family's safety because of your threats. It hurt Master William, who trusted you when you lied about why items were missing. It hurt my parents, who trusted you to protect our home and our heritage. And it hurt me, because I had to discover that someone I thought was honorable was actually a criminal. Alexander paused for a moment, thinking about what he wanted to say next. He was angry about the thefts, but he was also thinking about what kind of ruler he wanted to be when he inherited the throne someday. "Captain Roderick, you're going to be arrested and tried for your crimes," Alexander continued. "That much is certain. But I'm also going to talk to my father about reviewing the wages and working conditions for palace staff. If people feel undervalued or underpaid, that doesn't excuse criminal behavior, but it might help prevent similar problems in the future." Sir Edmund looked impressed by Alexander's mature response to the situation. "Your Highness, should I prepare the formal arrest documents?" "Yes," Alexander replied. "And please ensure that Thomas is officially recognized for his role in uncovering these crimes. He should be rewarded for his honesty and courage, not punished for it." "What about me?" Captain Roderick asked quietly. "What's going to happen to me?" "That will be decided by the royal court," Alexander said. "You'll have the opportunity to present your case and explain your actions. If you're willing to return everything you've stolen and provide information about any other crimes you've committed, that might be considered during your sentencing." Captain Roderick nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this was probably the best outcome he could hope for given the circumstances. Over the next hour, Sir Edmund formally arrested Captain Roderick and began the legal procedures for charging him with treason and theft. Master William conducted a detailed inventory of all missing items and began the process of recovering the stolen treasures from Henrik's antique shop. Thomas was officially commended for his role in uncovering the crimes and was promoted to a position with higher pay and greater responsibility. When King Marcus and Queen Isabella returned from the harvest festival, they were shocked to learn what had happened in their absence. King Marcus was angry about Captain Roderick's betrayal, but he was also proud of Alexander for handling the situation with such wisdom and maturity. "You could have simply reported your suspicions to me," King Marcus told his son that evening. "Why did you decide to investigate this yourself?" "Because I wanted to make sure that Thomas was protected," Alexander replied. "If I had just reported what I overheard, Captain Roderick might have been able to cover up his crimes and retaliate against Thomas and his family. By gathering solid evidence and catching him in the act, I made sure that justice would be done and that innocent people would be safe." Queen Isabella was particularly moved by Alexander's efforts to recover her diamond necklace. "This necklace means more to me than you know," she told him, tears in her eyes. "But I'm even more proud that you risked your own safety to protect a palace guard and his family. That shows the kind of king you'll be someday." The story of how Prince Alexander caught Captain Roderick became famous throughout the kingdom. People were amazed that such a young person had shown so much courage, intelligence, and compassion in dealing with such a difficult situation. The story was told and retold in taverns and marketplaces, with each telling emphasizing different aspects of Alexander's character. Thomas's family was especially grateful for Alexander's intervention. Thomas's little sister sent the prince a hand-drawn picture showing him as a brave knight protecting the palace. Thomas himself became one of Alexander's most loyal supporters and eventually rose to become the new head of palace security. Captain Roderick was tried and sentenced to 5 years in prison, followed by permanent exile from the kingdom. During his trial, he publicly apologized for his crimes and admitted that his actions had been motivated by greed rather than necessity. All of the stolen items were recovered and returned to their proper places in the royal collection. But perhaps the most important outcome of the entire incident was the way it changed Alexander's understanding of leadership. He learned that being a good ruler meant more than just making smart decisions, it also meant protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, seeking justice even when it was difficult or dangerous, and always trying to understand the underlying causes of problems rather than just punishing their symptoms. Years later, when Alexander became king, he would often tell this story to his own children, emphasizing the importance of courage, compassion, and integrity in leadership. And, whenever he faced difficult decisions as a ruler, he would remember the lessons he learned that autumn day when a young prince's curiosity and determination led to one of the most important discoveries in the kingdom's history. The palace staff never forgot how Prince Alexander had risked his own safety to protect one of their own, and that loyalty would serve him well throughout his reign. Thomas, in particular, remained one of King Alexander's closest advisors, and their friendship became a symbol of the bond between the royal family and the people they served.